As night falls in the woods, the body of a young girl lies spread-eagled in the grass, lifeless and cold. What was once a living, breathing child with her whole future ahead of her is now nothing more than an empty shell, left to rot into the soil and be forgotten to time. Or is she? As the sky grows cloudy and rain starts to fall, from deep within her corpse, several small figures begin to stir and emerge. This is how the comic, Beautiful Darkness, by French illustrators Marie Pompuy and Sébastien Cosette, opens its narrative. And though the death of a child is an ever-present mystery lingering in the background of several frames within the story, what happens to her and who she was isn't exactly what the story is about. You'd be surprised to know that the body of a child left in the woods is not the focal point at all. Instead, the spotlight goes to the tiny civilization that was born from inside her. Of course, obviously they represent something about this unknown little girl, but she's only ever really in the background. A constant, subtle reminder of mortality and how cruel that concept really, truly is. But because she and her death are not nearly as important as their newfound existence to the minuscule people who have taken refuge in her shadow, we, the audience, may never know exactly what her story is. There are hints, of course. The fact that there is a house not so far off that is the home of a lone and sinister man does not escape our notice, and the implications of that are very clear. However, this video is going to cover a completely different aspect of this comic's themes, so let's just put aside the deceased child and whatever that implies somewhere else, because that isn't the part I wanted to discuss in this video. Because there's not enough information in the story, I can't guarantee that I have any idea what the creators were trying to say with it. What I wanted to talk about is how this comic was so viscerally disturbing that it left me feeling sick to my stomach to the point I thought I might actually throw up. The story hides behind a falsely innocent art style of whimsy that is specific to children's book illustration, that only serves to make the brutal violence even more upsetting. Even these few available pages I was able to look at online shook me so much I was physically shaking, and it left me feeling out of it. My reaction to it was so visceral that I was distracted by it for a long time, and I couldn't focus on much around me. And I had to ask myself this question. Did I want to purchase Beautiful Darkness so that I could continue reading and find out where it was going, and maybe get some closure for the discomfort that it had put me in? But this book was upsetting me so badly, the feeling was just so negative I wasn't sure if I wanted to pursue it any further. What were my limits? And why was this comic making me feel so physically and spiritually ill? I eventually decided I would leave it alone and not read it anymore. There was no reason for me to wallow in something that was making me feel this badly, and that decision was something personal to me. So, I guess I should point out the obvious fact that I don't know every plot point or detail because I didn't finish the comic. So, if I do get anything wrong here, that's why. But my point is that even without the complete picture, this is what good art does to you. It leaves an impact. Whether you are left with a positive or negative experience, the worst thing that art can do is leave you indifferent. Perhaps you might have already read, or feel curious enough to read Beautiful Darkness, and not have even close to the same emotional response as I did, but for me, this was a true horror experience that left me shaken. But why? What did this comic touch upon that caused me this angst, other than nauseatingly casual violence? After doing a good amount of thought, and by that I mean a couple of years worth, as this comic always creeps its way back into focus, despite me trying to ignore it, in the end, what it spoke about for me that left me so sick was insignificance. To be fair, I'm sure this comic has quite a few more themes it touches upon, but I'm not making this video to talk only about Beautiful Darkness. I want to talk about size, and what it psychologically represents in the horror genre. I feel like there have been plenty of times in my life where I sat on the porch step and looked at the grass below me and watched small insects as they go about their life and thought, I wish I could be as small as them. I wish I could just shrink down and leave all my problems behind me. And there's so much children's media that touches on this type of thought. Stuff like The Borrowers or George Shrinks tell you that if you were small, then every day would be an adventure and you'd get to do all these cool things that your current size wouldn't allow you to do. Beautiful Darkness tells you that this concept is an awful, awful idea, because nature is indifferent to you and your suffering, and when you are so small, there is no one to hear you scream or feel empathy towards you. There is no one to miss you, and no one to mourn you. You simply cease to exist. How many small insects have you stepped on and never noticed? How many spiders, who are only minding their own business in a corner, have you squished without a second thought? How many small animals or bugs have been torn apart by your lawnmower? You have no idea, nor has it mattered enough for you to think about it. And if one of those insects happened to not be an insect at all, but a person shrunk down so small they are indiscernible, you would never know it. And so, the horror that is beautiful darkness is the fear of insignificance. There are many deaths in Beautiful Darkness, but it is the most callous and indifferent deaths that disturbed me so much. Deaths that are only focused on in one single frame and never brought up again, so that we can't even process what just happened except to read the same page over and over again in a vain attempt to find reason. But so many characters in the story that Beautiful Darkness has to tell have no ability to feel empathy, and the other ones that do must cast it aside in order to survive the cruel and punishing reality that is nature. Beautiful Darkness takes the concept of childish innocence and naivete, that undeveloped sense of right and wrong, and shows it that it isn't something that's pure and good. It's actually the pure embodiment of evil. I'm going to take a moment to focus on this scene of the comic in particular, because for any of you who might have watched my childhood trauma video, you'll know that this one was especially disturbing for me. This character eats another character alive in the middle of a conversation, just because they were hungry. There is no malice or contempt behind the action, no premeditated thought. It's a simple, instinctual moment, and there's no guilt or consequence for this decision, just like an animal. The other character doesn't respond to this in any normal human way. They just play along obliviously with it as if it's just some kind of game, as if it's all make-believe. This vile, terrifying act is followed by an abrupt return to them just acting like two little girls playing house. There's even acknowledgement that the character who got eaten alive is still alive. They're moving inside her tummy. The other character doesn't behave like they've just witnessed something awful, and they don't register that they might be in danger. They don't think, I should leave them, or I'm next, or even reprimand the other character, because there's this childish lack of understanding for what something good or bad is, and that is true evil. The only real thing most characters, aside from the main one, care for is their own self, their own needs, and their own amusement. Anything outside of themselves is nothing worth being reminded of. They embody the id, not so much a primal, feral idea of one as Freud would have you consider, but an indifferent one. A character is hungry, so they swallow one of their companions whole without a second thought, and the other companion has no reaction to it. Neither of their childlike brains even consider the danger or cruel evil of this action. A particularly small character is snatched by a bird, and though we don't see what happens to them, we have a good idea, and nobody else even notices that they were taken. The character is dragged into an ant tunnel, and we never see them again, and no one notices that they're missing. But how many times has any of these scenarios probably happened to an unsuspecting insect out in your lawn? But given the context of these characters having humanity, even if it's skewed, it makes these situations all the more disturbing, and that, for me, is true horror. I say that Beautiful Darkness was so awful that I won't ever finish it, but that's because the horror was so successful that it terrified me in a way I didn't know was possible. I'd believed myself to be desensitized by countless hours spent watching horror movies, playing video games, or reading scary stories, but this got to me. And for that I can only give it praise, even if I'll never finish it or touch it ever again. It's similar how Hereditary affected me. I love the movie, it's one of my favorite horror experiences, but I don't know if I could ever watch it again. So that brings me back to what I really wanted to discuss, and that is the themes of size and horror. I actually can't think of too many examples of the fear of being small, unnoticed while the world is indifferent to your suffering is a horror film. Most cases of smallness aren't given a horror treatment so much as they're used for entertaining children's fantasy. I think the closest we can get besides the comic is Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, or Honey, We Shrunk Ourselves, which does seem to touch upon the dangers of being small. I believe there is a movie, a very, very old black and white movie, about a mad scientist who shrinks a group of teens for his entertainment, but the theme of that, I feel, is more about control and power over others, which, to be fair, is another side of the fear of insignificance. I'm not going to claim that any old pulpy film had any sense of message behind it, but most of us can understand what being a teenager is like. We're so close to being adults and yet are not quite sure that we're there yet, and still powerless against older, more established adults who have full reign over us and many times abuse that power they have. And that's something this kind of scenario touches on, whether it meant to or not. So in the case of that film, it does indeed touch on self-worth and the sense of insignificance. So what does being big symbolize? If smallness is the fear of insignificance, then a movie where someone is forced to be huge is the fear of significance. You are the center of everything. Everyone is looking at you. Nothing is private. Everything you touch is affected by you. You are a walking, moving consequence, whether for the good or bad. But there are so few films that discuss this type of fear. Most movies that involve hugeness as a gimmick make a huge monster that destroys everything, but the fear again is of insignificance and powerlessness. We are not put in the shoes of the big creature, we are the terrified, screaming crowd scattering in its wake. The Godzilla franchise, the Gamera franchise, King Kong, Village of the Giants, anything that is big does not cover the fear of being significant at all. But then, I don't know if being too significant is a fear most can relate to. I think the majority of us are not major celebrities or politicians or even CEOs of a company. True, we do have responsibilities as we grow up and our behavior affects that. How we behave can hurt the people we love. But now, most of us can more easily become a celebrity with things like YouTube and Instagram and stuff that wasn't there 20 or so years ago. It's far more accessible than it ever used to be. So maybe that's something that can be touched upon more in the future. But I think the only two pieces of media that discuss this type of fear is Monsters vs. Aliens and the Goosebumps Monster Blood series. I think my first introduction with Monster Blood is the book where the kid accidentally eats some and continues to grow and grow with no hope of it ever stopping anytime soon. And that's the first time I've ever seen this concept not treated like a power fantasy, but like a horror scenario. Aliens vs. Monsters is of course not a scary film, but becoming huge ruins Susan's life. Of course, the movie shows her overcoming that. It's a happy, wholesome kids movie, but in a horror context, think about what that would do. What if you became something dangerous and hurt people without trying, without meaning to, because you don't know your own strength? What if you were so powerful that all you could do was collateral damage? What if every move you ever made could be seen by everybody? I think that's as equally terrifying a thought as not mattering to anyone at all, to never being noticed. Both concepts are unique, but are equally isolating in their own way. And that, I think, is the message of size and horror. And it's something that if utilized properly, can be very, very effective and horrifying. So, if you are interested in reading Beautiful Darkness, I'll offer a link to it in the description. I kind of walked away from my channel, life got in the way, and coming back I found that I'd gone from 30 subscribers to 100 in what felt like overnight. I mean, that's kind of a big deal. Thank you everyone who decided to keep me around. If you're only here for more Walton Files content, yeah, that's not happening, sorry. I said everything I thought needed to be said in that video, but again, thank you. I really do appreciate the response I've been getting so far from that video. So, if you've come this far, thank you so much for watching. YouTube is a just for fun hobby of mine, so if you want to support me, I do have a Teespring shop where I sell my art, so feel free to browse that if you like weird artwork on t-shirts. My bestseller right now is my Apathy Melting t-shirt. If you're into stuff that's cuter, I also have some wholesome designs as well. I'll leave links in the description. Anyway, I had a handful of videos planned for the future and a few of the scripts are 90% finished. I just have to get my energy and motivation back, so stay tuned for whenever that happens. Stay safe out there, y'all.